What's going on, everybody? What you're about to watch is an excerpt from this week's On the Margin interview with Vincent Deluard. Vincent is going to outline his thesis for why we are entering a period of secular inflation and why we are not going back to the Fed's 2% target. If you want to watch the whole video, which I highly recommend you do, all of the links you can find in the show notes on this episode. All right, guys, enjoy. I actually want to rewind the clock back to late 2020, early 2021. You were kind of very early and very loud, I would say, in calling for inflation, or at least that people should be worrying about it. This was at a time when there was no appetite on Wall Street or anywhere else to hear that prediction. What gave you the confidence? I know you know. What was your framework? Like, what gave you the confidence? What did you notice that or pay attention to that no one else did?
I think to understand why I turned bullish on inflation, you have to understand why we had disinflation for the past 40 years. And basically, it was cheap capital, cheap labor, cheap goods. I'll go very briefly because cheap capital, we had these massive excess savings from Europe because of the launch of the euro that created this huge trade surplus in Germany, Switzerland, etc. That could not be reinvested domestically. I mean, they tried a little bit, with the pigs, and sovereign debt crisis blew that up. So then Europe was generating about 500 billion in surpluses that were finding their ways into the U.S. Treasury market and U.S. assets. You had a similar situation going on with oil producers, OPEC, building all these massive reserves, sovereign wealth funds and so forth, all flowing into the Treasury market. And then on top of that, you had China joining WTO in 2000, with an artificially cheap exchange rate, and then they had to build reserves. So you had these three savings like rivers feeding into the US Treasury market. And that was almost like gravity. I mean, if you look at a chart of the 30-year yield since 2000, just down, as if a force was pulling it down. That's the first reason. Second reason, of course, is cheap goods. Everybody understands that. China opens up. So you have 1.4 billion people economy, super cheap exchange rate, good infrastructure, huge demographic bulge. I mean, this was just, if you look at the US CPI, and I think that is very important. I think we had two CPIs for a very long time. We had this artificial CPI at about 2%, but really that was a product of what I would call the US service CPI, which was running at 5%. So the US service CPI is things like healthcare, things like higher education, things like the cost of a ski lift ticket at Lake Tahoe, things like haircuts, but anything that was using American labor was going at 5%. And then you had the Chinese CPI, things like TVs, toys, electronics, garments, and more things as the Chinese economy diversified, which was actually dropping in price. And on average, that gave you 2%. But I would argue that 2% was fictitious. The real underlying inflation was already at 5%. We just didn't see it because we had this massive shock from China through the Walmart supply chains and then eventually Amazon. So that's on the good side. And then on the labor side, we had in 1995 the tequila crisis in Mexico. Suddenly, the Mexican peso lose 90% of its value. And over the next 10 years, you have 10 million Mexicans crossing the border. And these are young men, hardworking. They come in, ready to work, and huge downward pressure on wages. I mean, minimum wage hasn't increased in 40 years because of that. So you had these were the three engines of the great disinflation. Now, if I look at it today, they're all kind of breaking down at the same time. On the capital side, well, Europe no longer has a trade surplus, neither does Japan, or at least it's shrinking very rapidly. And we're going to need our own savings in order to mobilize them to rebuild an army and pay for our retiring boomers. So European and Japanese will no longer be financing the shopping habits of Americans. Of course, OPEC, Russia, China are no longer buying US treasuries because they don't want to, and even if they do, their assets can be seized by fiat. So that's gone. And on the good side, trade wars, China is aging, friendshoring, all these things. I mean, that pool of Chinese labor anyway it's shrinking. I mean, the working age population of China peaked 10 years ago. Now it's the actual population that is shrinking, and it's going to shrink massively because of the one-child policy, right? Every 25 years, Chinese population is going to almost halve. So we will no longer have access to this seemingly infinite pool of highly qualified, hardworking workers. So that's gone. And then on the labor side, you actually had negative flow from Mexico for the past 10 years, and that accelerated with COVID. So these to me are the structural drivers of inflation. And this is the reason why I think inflation is secular. And these are things that the Fed cannot really do much about. I mean, if anything, I mean, yeah, it can hike rates and send the economy into nasty, nasty recession, but why? I mean, it's like, trying to swim upriver at this point. For 20 years, the current was disinflationist. So it was very easy for central bankers to hit the 2% target. They had nothing to do. They could look at other things like, oh, let me target the price of the S&P 500. Let me target climate change, racial equity, because it was easy. Like the inflation was going on its own. And now we're moving to a new environment where instead of swimming downriver, they're swimming upriver. And they will find that just, the cost of keeping that 2% target is prohibitively expensive. And my expectation is that they'll put up a fight because, nobody gives up without a fight, which is where we are right now. But then after some time, they'll be like, hey, listen, this is too hard. We're not going to, don't want to break the labor market. We don't want to have 10%, Fed funds rate. We don't want to have massive unemployment. We're just going to go with it and accept that inflation is structurally higher. Again, there's this concept that I like to, people talk about R star, right? The natural rate, on the economy, whatever. That to me, that is like, okay,
Can you
it's
explain
like
what
the
that
whole,
is, Vincent? Can you
yeah,
just, because
yeah,
the
yeah,
Fed pays
yeah,
attention. Yeah.
yeah. If you're Catholic, it's like the Holy Ghost at Mass. So it's there, but nobody can see it. But you have to trust that it's there, and you have to trust the man with the authority who tells you that it's there because you can't see it. But the Fed people can spend hours writing papers about it, and no one can call them on it because no one knows what it is. Supposedly, it's the natural level of interest rate of the economy that is neither accommodative nor restrictive, but you can't see it. I think that's somewhat of a useless concept. What I like to focus more on is the I star. So there will be the optimal level of inflation. And I believe that is something that exists that no one pays attention, but that is different in every decade.
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue that there was a natural level of inflation in the 2000 and 2010 that was, let's say, maybe 1.8% in the US and 1% in Europe, 0% in Japan. It was just falling for the reasons that I was highlighting. And
Mm-hmm.
now that I star is kind of rising, uh, and it seems to me that it would be a lot easier to just accept that rather than fight it.